Hello everyone, and welcome back to your second year of graphic design. Although it looks a little bit different this year, we're still going to have a lot of fun and hopefully we can be back in person soon. With that being said, I would like to go back over some of the stuff that we started in Graphic Design 1 of the basic elements and principles and organization of space, so it's all fresh in our heads, ready to go as we get into our first project this year. In this lesson, we're going to be covering the elements of design, which are the building blocks of design. Principles are going to be how we use these elements of design in our space. So the first element of design is line. There's different types of line, but it can be defined as a moving point in space. But it can also be non-existent. If you were to point at something anywhere in the room that you're sitting in right now, you are creating what's called an implied line. That is a line that is not actually there, but carries the viewer's eye from one place to another, just like an actual line does. You can also create implied lines by repeating small shapes. Like if you think about the road, if you're driving down the road, those yellow dashed lines in the middle, they're not connected, they're not one piece in some places, but those spaces in between, those small spaces, are going to create that movement of carrying your eye through the space. A final way to create movement using that type of implied line is creating a shape that has a hard edge like an arrow. Creating that sharp edge is going to again carry the viewer's eye across your space. The next element of design is going to be shape. Shape is a flat item on your design, so you don't want to confuse that with form, which is going to be the next one, the three-dimensional type of shape. Shapes can be geometric and they can also be organic, so it's important to think about both of those as you're choosing a style of graphic design. Geometric shapes are going to be what you would think about in geometry class, like a square, a rectangle, a triangle, things that you can measure using what you would use as a geometric formula. Something that is an organic shape is going to be a shape that you find in nature. We're all organic shapes. Actually, if you divide your face in half on both sides, it's not exactly even, which is a great example of an organic shape. But if you go outside and find a leaf, same thing, right? That's going to be an organic shape. So going into form, it's going to be the same thing. However, it has volume. It's something that you can pick up. It's something that is actually existent in the space. The fourth element of design is value, and it's going to be the lightness or darkness of tones of color. You want to think about creating a nice value range in your space to create contrast. The lightest value is going to be white, the darkest value is going to be black, but you want to also think about how you can add these white and black values to your colors to create a variety of colors within your space. The space is going to be the next one. There's positive and negative space in every design, and it's important to think about your negative space just as much as you think about your positive space. The positive space is the subject, so people tend to focus on the subject and not think as much about that negative space. But if you've ever seen the FedEx logo, you'll know that the negative space in that logo is so important because it actually forms an arrow. It's not actually there, but there is an arrow formed with the letters. So thinking about the space that you're creating around or within your items that you're actually placing within your design platform is so important because you don't want to create any awkward spaces. Color is the next one. Colors are made of three properties: hue, value, and intensity. We want to think about color, very specifically the color harmonies as we're creating our designs. For example, if you want colors to contrast in your design, which means pop, right, stand out, they're highly different, they want to be across from each other on the color wheel. Those are called complementary colors. So if you think about any holiday or sports team, those are going to generally fall across from each other on the color wheel on purpose. You can also go find different color harmonies on the color wheel. One is going to be analogous, which are going to be 3 colors directly next to each other on the color wheel that flow really nicely. And you can do split complementary, which will be like complementary, but instead of going directly across, it splits the 2 next to it. As we get into more of our designs, we'll talk about more of these color harmonies, but there is a great app called Adobe Color, and I think that everybody should really give that a chance as you're planning and organizing your designs, because it really helps you pull colors together that are going to work and follow these specific color rules. The last element of design is going to be texture. Texture is going to be either actual or implied. So if you were to turn to the person next to you and touch their head, you could actually feel their hair. That's actual texture. But if you're looking at a picture of a really cute puppy on the computer, you can't actually touch that. That's going to be implied texture. Now that we've talked about the elements of design, we're going to move on to the principles. Again, the elements are the building blocks of how your space is created, and the principles is how you actually arrange those elements within the space. The first principle of design is variety. Variety is used to add interest to your art piece. So it's adding just the right amount of the elements in your design to create a space that becomes more interesting for the viewer. Contrast is going to be any extreme opposites between the elements of design. For example, going back to color that we were talking about before, the most contrasting colors or the most contrasting values will create contrast in your design to really make one pop off of the other. So the most contrasting values, again, are black and white. The most contrasting colors are going to be anything that is directly across from each other on the color wheel. Think about sports teams, holidays. Those are complementary colors. The emphasis in a graphic design is going to be whatever draws your eye in first. It makes your eye go to that design. And that can be done with contrast. It can be done with size, placement on the page. Naturally, as we look at a design, we want to go to the top left-hand corner. And if you think about it, if you pick up anything, if you're going to read it, that's where you look. In the English language, we read from left to right, top to bottom. So we're naturally drawn to that top corner. There's something that's called the rule of thirds that is going to divide the space into thirds both directions. That top left-hand corner intersection is a really great place to always put an emphasis of your design to naturally draw the eye to that space. Balance is also very important in the design. You don't necessarily have to have exactly the same things on both sides. However, you want to create even weights on left to right, top to bottom. That can be done a variety of ways. Think about if something is very heavy, maybe it is a deeper value, then you can create more items on the other side to make up for that darker value on the one side. You can also create the same shape. There's so many ways that you can do that using the elements of design. Proportion is also really important. You want to think about the spatial relationship of everything within the space. You want it to make sense. So if I was standing next to a giraffe, I don't want the giraffe to be smaller than myself, and vice versa. It's going to create interest in the design. It's going to make it look more accurate, create that depth that makes it a more interesting space. Harmony and unity. Unity is something that you want to think about. If not anything else, that's probably the most important thing because it's going to make the design look whole. It makes it all come together. It's repeating the elements of design throughout the space enough so that it looks like it is a consistent design. Again, with color as an example, if you were to use the same color throughout the design, maybe for all of the headings in a design, it's going to unify that space. Rhythm and movement are what carry your eye throughout the design. We started talking about the rule of thirds of dividing the space. Using that, you can create what's called a Z pattern or F pattern of design. There have been studies that have tracked eye movement across designs or successful designs that go in a Z pattern throughout the design or an F pattern, as you can kind of visualize. Your eye is drawn naturally to that top left-hand corner and follows the shape of the letter throughout the space. ways to create rhythm or movement can be repeating a shape across the space. It can be creating what I was talking about before in line, an implied line. An eyesight line is a really good implied line as well. So if you have a character or an animal, something that is, an animated object in your design looking a certain direction, you're naturally going to look at what they are looking at within the space. Another way to do that, again, is creating a sharp edge, an arrow of some sort where it's going to bring your eye across and through that space. Just creating a strong visual hierarchy can help with that as well. So having your items from biggest to smallest, the most contrasting values as the most important, can really bring your eye from one piece to the next, creating that great rhythm and movement. Hopefully all of these terms sound familiar from last year. Let's go ahead and take a look again at now how to arrange your design space using these elements and principles of design. Tip number 1, use scale and variety to add depth or interest in your design. So looking at this example here on the right-hand side with the whale and the scuba diver, thinking about how big a whale actually is in real life, and looking at the value of both the whale and the scuba diver, it wouldn't make sense that the scuba diver is as big as the whale in this scene. This would mean that the whale would be very far out in the distance, but really there's nothing telling us that visually. So if we look at the second one, the scale and size are not only more interesting to look at, but they make more sense. Both the whale and the diver are on the same plane of space, but the diver is much smaller to add more interest to this scene, and it just makes more sense visually. Number 2, use color to create contrast. Okay? Contrast are opposite. So we talked about how opposite colors on the color wheel are the most contrasting colors. The most contrasting values are going to be black and white. You can also create contrast by using any of the other elements of design. So, for example, maybe the size of shapes. If you have a smaller shape and a bigger shape, you're going to naturally be drawn to the bigger shape, unless maybe the color is a brighter, bolder color that contrasts for the smaller shape. So looking at our example here of the before and after, you can see that the little man in the middle with the hands raised up in the air is the one that is different out of all of these little men that are standing. But it doesn't stand out. You barely notice that it's different. So looking at the second example where the intensity of that color is increased, it really does pop off the background. And here's our color wheel just for the reference I was talking about before. Notice that the colors across from each other are going to really create contrast. Here are all of our complementary colors. You can think about sports teams, you can think about holidays. Those are typically in those categories. Number 3, use your negative and positive space well. So in this lesson, I talked about previously the negative space being just as important as the positive space. Well, you also want to use that negative space to your advantage whenever you can. So looking at this first example here of the astronaut and the moon or planet, you can see that there really isn't a lot of negative space. The subject is really the astronaut and the moon. The negative space is going to be the space around, which we have almost none. There's really no benefit to what you're seeing here. Well, in the second example, there's what is referred to before as an implied line. An implied line is an imaginary line that draws your eye across the plane. Well, the diver or astronaut here is going to be looking directly at the planet. That eyesight line carries your eye naturally across this negative space, and it's just much more interesting set up like this than it was originally with no negative space really at all. So much better solution here. You can also see that variation of size that we just saw with the diver and the whale above, where the planet is just a little bit smaller. It's running off the plane on the rule of thirds, and the astronaut is actually bigger and in the foreground. Here's another great example, maybe from creating a logo, where the negative space works. There's really not a lot of awkward negative space here, but by combining the objects and creating a shape within the negative space, it just becomes much more interesting to look at and works together really, really well. Number 4, use the idea of shape and form to change perspective. So looking at our drawing on the left-hand side, you can see this man working at his desk. Depending on what I'm trying to be advertising or saying with this image, maybe I'm talking about the work that he's actually doing or the organization of his workspace. Well, this solution wouldn't work as well as our second solution where we could see the top of the desk. So think about the three-dimensional form of the actual item that you're drawing two-dimensionally. Is there a better solution for a different perspective that you can take to make the design work better with what you are actually trying to say as an artist? And finally, number 5, limit your color palette to create unity. I mentioned before, Adobe Color is a wonderful app. I definitely recommend checking that out. I definitely use it. It gives you some really cool examples of color harmonies that you can use. It also lets you create your own using this first tool here. So I definitely would check that out. But it's important to limit your colors in your design no matter what. As you start creating a graphic design, I would try to stick to 3 colors max. And then if you have to add a couple extra, that could work. But the less, the better to make your design look uniform, and it's automatically going to make it look continuous and nice and unified if you limit those colors. So talking about the color options here in Adobe, we have analogous, which are going to be typically 3 colors right next to each other on the color wheel. Monochromatic are going to be 1 color, but then all of its shades and tints. Shades and tints are adding black or white to that color. So it's 1 single color with black and white added to it. If you add black to a color, it's called a shade. If you add white to a color, it's called a tint. A really good way to remember that is if you're outside on a really sunny day and you're sitting underneath a tree, you are in the shade. It's darker in the shade. So you can think about adding the black to a color, that it's a shade, and white to a color, that it's a tint. So that's monochromatic. Triadic are 3 evenly spaced colors on the color wheel. Complementary, we've talked about already, are right across from each other on the color wheel. And split complementary is going to be right across, but it splits the 2 next to it. So these are really good ones to think about right now as we're getting started in graphic design. Definitely recommend checking this out. And now let's check out 5 more tips that focus on the placement and visual hierarchy within your graphic design. And with this, we're going to go over another 5 tips of how to use visual hierarchy to arrange your space, again using those elements and principles of design that we've already talked about. Think about visual hierarchy as the order of which your eye moves throughout the design, or the order of which you see things in the actual design layout. We've already talked about emphasis as being the first point that you look at in your design. You want to create that by having a high contrast area, by having different sizes, different values, something that's going to draw your attention to that place. Well, the first tip is create a flow with the Z pattern or F pattern. These are both patterns of eye movements that you can create in your design to make a successful layout. So looking at Facebook here on the right hand side, you can see this Z pattern that's demonstrated on the left, where you move from the title across the page down to spot number 3 here where the image is, and then you follow through down at the bottom of the page, making this nice eye movement path throughout the space. If you go to the second one, it does the exact same thing, but instead of a Z letter, you can see it's in the form of an F. So we're again drawn across, and then finally finish here at the bottom. As you create this pattern, think about your rule of thirds, right? The title or whatever is most important, that focal point is probably best suited if you can place it somewhere on the crossing rule of thirds on your design. So you can see that Facebook does hit that rule of thirds location. That's not exactly in the right spot as far as the second line, but it is on the rule of third line on the left-hand side. You want to, number 2, place with purpose and with the rule of thirds. So going along with what I was just talking about, notice in the before picture, the man that's running is placed exactly in the center. This design was divided into a grid system, so it's set up exactly with the rule of thirds in the background. And if we move the man to this side of the design, hitting that line of the rule of thirds, it's much more successful to look at. However, I kind of disagree with this design. I would have placed the man on the other side of the design, because typically when you have a person or an animate object that's facing a certain direction in a design, you want to give them more space to see in front of them or to move in front of them, rather than placing them right up against the wall of the design. So I would have done the same thing, but moved him back on this rule of third line instead of the one that he's at right now. Maybe if they were going to put information or something on this side, this would make sense, but just visually how it stands, I'd bump him over. Number 3, use lines to move the eyes. So we talked about 2 major types of line. Lines can be actual or implied lines. In this first design, or first 2 designs, you can see a lot of actual lines that are going to carry your eye through this space. Okay, so you can see on this one, we're following through. Notice that the lines intersect through those rule of third points. Same thing here, right? Nice line movement that's carrying you throughout the space. But also remember, the implied lines can do the same thing. So we have this eyesight line from this character that's looking down, again crossing through to the rule of thirds. The eyesight line looking down again. We have another line that's carrying us through. None of these white lines that are drawn actually exist within this painting that was done, but it does create those nice implied lines that are movement. Other ways to create implied lines are going to be with pointing. So if you were to point at something, you're naturally going to look at what somebody else is looking at or pointing at. A sharp edge or an arrow. So if you have an actual arrow or just maybe a box that has a sharp edge on it, you'd be able to look from that edge to whatever that arrow is pointing at. Number 4, align everything with something else in the design. So looking at our before picture, you can see that nothing is placed with purpose. You always want to place or align something with something else that already exists in the design space. So if you look at the second one, you can see that the letters actually align exactly where the start and end of the frying pan are. And all of those little fruits and veggies and food items are now aligned exactly center, spaced out as we go down through the space rather than just sporadically thrown on top of theirs. So the second one works much better. It's much more concise, especially with text. See if you can start it and end it with an object. Think about capital letters. If you're writing capital letters next to a sharp edge, you can create that nice space in between. If you have 2 different words that you're using in a title, maybe you can align them with each other. We'll get into more of that with our typography unit, but for right now, try to align with purpose whenever possible. And number 5, use scale to show what is important. So looking at our before business card, there's really no size difference in the text that exists here. It's all very thin font. Not a lot to really catch your attention of what's most important. In the second one, just by raising the name of the person a little bit bigger, making it bolder, changing the color, you really look at that first. There's no question which text that you're going to read first. So think about what you want your viewer to see first. What is the purpose of your design? By deciding that purpose, then decide what items within your design they should see first. What should they see second? What should they see third? Think about that size. Think about the contrast to make them look in the places that you want to. Try to go back up to number 1 and create that Z pattern, F pattern of movement throughout your space. Please consider these tips and techniques as we go through each project over the course of this year. This video will be here if you ever need to come back.